Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Doshin Nelson Roshi. He is a Rinzai Zen lineage holder, a troublemaker, a poet. I'd call him a friend, actually, as well. Good guy. Really happy to have you here today, Doshin. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's good to see you again, Mark.
Yeah, you too, man. You too. How did you get interested in the body? What was your journey with the body?
Oh, man. It was just there. As soon as I showed up, the body was already here. How could you not be interested in the body?
So were you like a sporty person growing up? Were you into sort of this alternative stuff? You were into that?
I was very competitive in every sport that I got into.
And just to place you a little bit for the audience, where was this you were growing up?
I grew up in a small farming community in Colorado.
Okay.
High in the mountains.
And Zen. So this is your main thing. Your main no thing. So how did you get into
one of my main things?
What was the route into that?
Suffering.
Great.
Craziness. It tends to create suffering. And so I stumbled into meditation when I was 17 years old, many years ago. And it really changed my life. It saved my life, actually. It wasn't Zen meditation. It was other forms of meditation.
It's interesting, almost every speaker we've had on, when I've asked them, why did you get interested in embodiment? They all said, I was suffering in one way or another. So it's even injury, or for most of them, like more psychological stuff, actually. And then they were willing to look outside the mainstream culture.
Yeah, there was so little refuge inside the mainstream culture for me.
And people, it's a horrible question, but what is Zen?
What is Zen? What is Zen? Boy, that's just such a wonderful koan. What is Zen?
What's a koan?
A koan is an enigmatic question, a troublesome question that the thinking mind can't answer.
Thank you.
So when you wrestle with a koan, with one of these enigmatic questions that the thinking mind can't answer, if you get serious enough, the thinking mind suddenly ties itself in knots. And all of a sudden you have an insight.
Yes.
And that insight is Zen.
Got it.
It's where thinking stops and insight fills the empty sky.
Going to be one of these Zen poet motherfucker sessions. I'm not going to answer this. Zen people never answer a question straight. You're like, do you want sugar in your coffee? And they're like, what is the sound of one sugar? It's... I'm not going to get a straight answer, but that's okay. You know what? Fuck it. I've been working hard. I like you. Let's just hang out and play. That's all good. We'll do it the Zen way. So I'll blend. So, okay. So what's the Zen insight about the body?
The body and the mind are not separate.
Got it.
Emptiness is form. Form is emptiness.
Never knew what that meant.
It means the mind and the body aren't separate.
Okay. So, mind and the body aren't separate. And in your form of Zen, which is a contradiction I know already, in your form of Zen, I've done a couple of retreats with you guys, you actually do body-based stuff as well, right? Like sort of movement and qigong.
Of course.
And that's pretty rare for a Zen tradition.
It is rather rare, especially the way we do it. Why
do you do that?
Well, I think the main reason is my teacher, who's a bit of a troublemaker himself, as you well know. He is not only a Zen master, he's also a yogi. He studied with Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois in India for years. He's quite accomplished as a yogi. So that naturally leads itself to a more rigorous sense of embodiment practices. And my background is in the martial arts. I ran a chain of judo and karate schools in New York across the East Coast. So, and I'm well aware that that's your background. And Kogan, one of my students and Junko's students, whose teaching he's the one that insisted that you and I have this conversation. And he's a Kung Fu master, quite practiced.
Yeah. And, the Japanese Buddhism has a strange relationship to the body, because on the one hand, it's influenced the martial arts hugely in Japan. But on the other hand, sometimes there's this tradition of sort of sit down and pretend you don't have a body. That seems to be part of some schools.
I think that's a little misleading. I don't think that's true. Again, the mind and the body aren't separate. Now, my experience of martial arts gave me an intuitive understanding of what Zen is that was far more profound than I found on the cushion. Zen and martial arts are not separate, not in Japanese culture. Intricately the same.
Yes.
Sensei, one of your teachers, by nature was a very accomplished Zen master, in my view.
He wasn't in the formal tradition of Zen.
So no, he was a Zen master.
Okay, so he didn't have the piece of paper, but he somehow managed it.
There is no paper in Zen.
There's scrolls and lineage scrolls and things. Very formal. Japanese. They've got a list. Okay, so, all right, where do we want to go with this then? So Zen was responsible for massive atrocities in World War II. If it's such a great school of...
So I don't know that I would agree with that.
No,
human beings were responsible for massive atrocities in every war.
Okay, let me reframe that then. The Institute of Japanese Zen was fully supportive in almost every case of atrocities the Japanese committed, which were on a par with Hitler's for sure.
Yeah. And I don't see that as being any different than any genocide. I'm not excusing it because it's true. There was one Zen master who resisted the emperor during World War II and refused to participate in the war. And the emperor sent his bodyguard to visit this Zen master. And he said, "You either bring me back his submission or his head." So he went to the Zen master and he explained why he was there and what his instructions were. And the Zen master just quietly bowed, exposing his neck. In other words, take my head. This so deeply moved the bodyguard that he returned to the emperor without the head, and they left this Zen master alone. That was a real enlightened Zen master that was fearless in the face of death. Now, unfortunately, that was the exception to the rule. And other things like the morality of supporting and being loyal to the emperor far exceeded the enlightenment and integrity of that one Zen master. He was an exception to the rule. I don't think it's any different today.
What do you mean today?
Well, I look at the war in Afghanistan. I look at the war in Iraq. I look at World War II. I look at Sarajevo. I look at all the genocides, what's going on in Yemen right now. There are very few people which will stand up in the face of death against such overwhelming opposition in power.
Yes.
And I suspect there are a lot more than we know, but they're dead and we can't find them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In terms of this tradition then, which is coming from medieval Japan and it has a track record of supporting genocide, like how does that fit in the modern world?
Well, again, I don't know that I take exception at your generality.
But it's all but one. That's a fair generality if it's all but one.
Well, it is not a fair generality because it's in the context of a very anti-Zen attitude. That would be like saying all martial artists are killers.
Well, that's not historically true, but this was the case historically.
Well, if you look at the Korean army, the North Korean army, and their use of the martial arts, they're using it in the same way the Japanese emperor used Zen, they've militarized it.
Yes, Taekwondo for sure.
And it's no different in Israel with their version of the martial arts, which is quite deadly.
Krav Maga, you mean?
Yes.
There's different communities within that, not all of whom are anti-Palestinian.
But you see, it's the same in Zen. Making that generality is a very misleading statement.
But I'm simply pointing to a historical truth that did happen, and I feel brushing it under the carpet, we miss a lesson for all of us.
I have no intention of brushing it under the carpet, but I really take exception that you're seeing it as an isolated case when I see it quite extensive. I mean, I look at what's happening in America right now, or Britain with Brexit, and I see the polarization that's occurring in the culture wars.
Yes.
It's no different now than it was then.
I want to come to that, but it is different, because what we don't have a widespread a spiritual tradition of Buddhism that I can think of in another country that's so widely supported such an abomination. Now, that doesn't mean that Burmese Buddhists, for example, are without blame in current events there. It doesn't mean that Sri Lankan Buddhists were not involved with things in Sri Lanka.
So let me just interrupt here and let me just ask you what facts you're pointing to, because
the fact that every Zen teacher bar one in your, as you've just admitted, was actively supportive of genocidal policies in World War II.
I don't think that's true. Support of the emperor is a cultural thing in Japan that is just it's as important as, I mean, it's a cultural phenomena.
Yes.
It's a moral value that is universal in Japan, especially feudal Japan.
Sure, agree.
And that would be like going into a postmodern culture, a liberal culture, Democrats in the U.S., and the Me Too movement has the same kind of fervor.
I want to get to that, and don't think I'm just going to give Zen a hard time. Like we got a couple of other value sets to work through. But for me, it was an example of
this is an extreme example, which I'm not arguing with that being true.
Yes,
but I don't see it as that different than what's happening everywhere I look. And it's actually ironic. It's Zen that gives me that insight.
Okay, you know what? I feel like I've challenged on this, and you've refuted, and that's okay. We can move on. So, if one thing that's fucked up is this kind of like nationalist way of doing religion, whether it be Zen or any other, just to be a bit fairer here, and that can lead to genocide because country right or wrong, emperor right or wrong, whether it's the Catholic Church supporting or whoever. Islam, certainly, absolutely without doubt in Islam, the violence coming from a certain take of that. What about this postmodern trend then, which is another way of using spirituality that may be harmful?
Boy, this is a difficult subject to really communicate about with just two people.
Yes.
Let alone on a podcast to a very broad audience. With very different experiences and different language. It's most difficult subject to do justice to.
Doshin, that's a brilliant point. Before you say more, I just want to really underline that as a point that if we were me and you just talking as individuals, there's some chance of us communicating. And as we've just seen, even there's some potential for friction. But, I mean, we know each other. We like each other, I think. We have some good history together. And still we're just having some disagreement. Now imagine this, listening to this podcast is 10,000 people. We can't look them in the eye. We've never met them. They're from different countries, radical different political beliefs. I mean, that's a hell of an ask to even communicate anything, let alone around a delicate topic, right? Like I just want to underline the wisdom of what you just said.
Yeah, I'm kind of fond of what I heard Byron Katie say one time. She says, we don't talk to each other. We talk to each other's projections.
Got it.
And that's only true in 98% of the time.
So I don't hate Byron Katie. I just hate my projection of her and her work. That's good. Okay. She might be lovely. That's a good example. So I interrupted you there, Doshin. So how would you begin to communicate some of the challenges of sort of embodied spirituality in this postmodern world?
Yeah. Well, I would have to, if I were talking to an individual, I would slow way down, and I would make sure that we were talking about the same experiences. I'm oriented toward experience. I'm a Zen master. So once I had determined that we were talking about a similar experience when we talk about something that is, quote, spiritual, then I would go very carefully and make sure that we were using the same words to describe the experience.
Yes.
Let me give you an example.
Please.
An example is the word feeling in English.
Yes.
It is just so ambiguous. And this is one that really gets involved in embodiment practices as I've experienced them. What do you mean feeling? What experience are we talking about? Are we talking about this body sense of a sensation, like a pleasant sensation, like taking a hot shower?
Yes.
Or are we talking about an emotion,
yes.
like happiness? Or are we talking about a feeling like a liking and a disliking? A preference and a prejudice, which is a judgmental quality? Or are we talking about intuition, which is this not knowing that knows, this evolution of the sense of smell, this instant knowing?
Yes.
The Gnostics called it gnosis. So we have to stop and go very slowly and make sure that when we use words like spirituality or feelings, that we're really focused on the same experience. Because if we're not, we've got no chance in hell of communicating.
Yes. So my teacher, Paul Linden, often says, I use the word cat, you use the word cat, but we've never seen a cat. And actually what a cat is quite different depending on where in the world you are. Is it a tiger? Is it a skinny one in the desert? Is it a big fat British cat? This we have to make sure we're talking about the same thing. For me here as well, like feeling can be broken down. As you say, is it sensation? Is it feeling tone? Is it, I feel you're right, Doshin, which is just the linguistic way of saying, I think you're right. So how does that relate to this era of postmodernism we find ourselves in?
Yeah. Well, being a Zen master, I hate to say this, and I really hesitate to say it, but I've just, at urging of two of my students, I've just finished reading several books so that they said my education was incomplete and I needed to read. So because I listen to my students, they're my teachers often, I've learned a great deal from them. I've read 3 books that deeply influence the way I look at the question you just asked. One of the books is The Righteous Mind.
Jonathon Haidt.
Yes, you've read that book.
No, I watched the YouTube video because I'm young. He's fucking good, though. He's very good. He's very good. I like him a lot. I feel like he gives the left and the right their share. He doesn't take a side,
Well, I feel that he does take a side, but he does it very fairly. So that's almost what you said, but it's a little different.
I like your precision. What was your conclusion from reading him then?
Well, I was delighted that he treated the subject with great rigor, great curiosity, some imagination, and I felt that he still hadn't gone beyond the liberal postmodern view, even though he saw the problems with it much more clearly than most. I don't think he had grown beyond it, and the book left me hungry.
Right. So just to summarize, a liberal, American and England, that's used differently, that word. So liberal, yes. What we'd call left-leaning in most of Europe, and postmodern view, meaning there is no truth, morals are relative, everything's a perspective, it's all just an opinion. Is that like a fair summary of this worldview that we could talk about a long time?
Yeah, I think in England, there's a long history of the word liberal, and it has a different meaning. That's one of those words that there's very different experiences associated with it. Not as diverse as the word feeling or body even. But I think a liberal and a postmodern philosophical view would be synonymous in the U.S., okay, where there's a difference between them, and yes, particularly in England.
Yes.
So I think you're correct, and I'm not familiar enough with what that difference is to know whether what you said was true or not.
Okay. So an example of this, Haidt studies values, doesn't he? So there's particular values associated with different groups in society.
Well, he studies morals.
Okay.
And he articulates it in terms of a moral matrix, a metaphor of the movie that's so influenced, the younger generation, younger than me. And he says that when we talk about morals, we're really talking about polarization. And I'm just looking for the graph. A picture's worth 1,000 words. It's so helpful.
People won't be able to see the picture on the podcast, though. So
yes, but it'll give me the words that I'm feeling to remember. Anyway, the postmodern, what I would say liberals, which are really have a more socialistic bent, they think that the common good of the whole is more important than the individual.
Yes,
which is one of the characteristics of the liberals in the U.S.
We've all voted on chopping your nose off, this kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. So the strength and the moral value that they focus on has to do with care.
Yes.
Being nice and focusing on care. That's one of 6 different moral values that a more middle-of-the-road conservative would equally hold as important.
Yes.
But they don't think it's as important as the postmodern people think it is. So in other words, what he's saying is that the postmoderns focus on one of 6 different categories of morality. Mm-hmm. And they think it is the most important thing. And it means that binds them together in a whole, in what he calls a hive mentality, a group that shares that value. And it also blinds them to the values that other groups share.
Yes.
So it binds and blinds.
Yes. And I, as someone that's pushed back against this, I like to remind myself there's actually a beautiful value there. Like if someone's arguing about, I don't know, immigration or some other issue, there's a sense that is coming from a value of care, which I may share and may also want to add to.
Yes. Yes. So it points out that no matter what morality or measure of morality you're talking about, and he identifies 6 that are quite historically active, that all of them will bind and blind at the same time. They bind us together into cohesive groups where we can accomplish things, but they also blind us to things that we can't see. They create blind spots that become shadows that can be very activated when aligned with what I would call an archetypal energy or image or symbol.
And this care is often a kind of, I'd call it idiot care. I'm looking for a nicer word for it. So in Buddhism, there's a concept that's equivalent to this, that it's sometimes true compassion to do something that could seem harsh.
Yes.
As opposed to always being fluffy and nice and actually being a more violent thing.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
What's the Buddhist view on that? There is one, isn't there?
Well, yes, it's called compassion.
But the view of compassion, which isn't just always fluffy.
That fluffy compassion is a postmodern invention. It doesn't exist in feudal Japan where people are just trying to survive. Mm-hmm. It's an evolutionary, like another such thing is the feeling of shame. Mm-hmm. And again, we have to be careful because in Europe, we have to differentiate between shame and guilt. In America, shame means the story that I tell myself if I'm experiencing shame is that there's something wrong with me. Usually I'm not good enough. I don't measure up in some way.
Yes.
Where guilt is, I'm guilty. I did something. I actually did it.
Got it.
Now, it gets a little mushy in my experience in teaching in Europe. You have to be very careful whether we're talking about something that you've done or something that you feel inadequate in, which gives you an emotional feeling of shame.
Yes, I've heard guilt described as private and shame described as public, and guilt sometimes contrasted in Buddhism, Theravada Buddhisms with healthy regret. So guilt, one being a sort of self-judgment morally, and one being more attunement with one's own values. Like, hey, I didn't actually live up to my standards and I really want to feel that pain. And I've also, just lastly on this, I was just in the Middle East where they say Christianity is a guilt-based religion and Islam is a shame-based religion. in the, like, you can motivate differently with this cultural differences and how people kind of motivate around these. And it seems to me a lot of the postmodernism is based around shaming and public shaming.
And I would argue that shame doesn't even appear in the spectrum until postmodernism.
Okay.
What you described as guilt being internal and shame being external is exactly the flip side of how we would describe it in the U.S.
Right. Okay. So worth defining. Okay.
Yeah. So this really has created a lot of confusion in the work that I do, which is a lot around shame. Before I realized that you have to be very careful and really describe what we're talking about. Yes. What is the experience? Or we end up, just in total confusion.
Yes. So I found that. Go on.
The thing that I wanted to point out was something that happened with the Dalai Lama.
Yes.
In Dharamsala, a group of neuroscientists were there listening to the Dalai Lama and communicating with him. And one of them talked about shame as a form of self-loathing. There's something wrong with me and I hate myself. He stopped the interview and he conversed with his interpreters, especially the American ones. And he really didn't get self-loathing. In Tibet or in any First Nation culture, self-loathing is not known. There is no such thing as self-loathing. This is, in my view, this comes from having parents that are modern, and it's all about winning. So if you're a loser, then you begin to learn to loathe yourself. So this assumption which is a naive assumption, that we are the same now emotionally as they were 1,000 years ago.
Yes.
Is just not grounded in any sense of reality.
Well, normally this is presented as a way of idealizing tribal cultures and other cultures like Tibet. I actually say you can make a developmental argument for that.
Exactly. Which is what I do.
You need an abstraction of self, right? Like that's
exactly. So this is one of the areas of confusion that when we bring this into what is a really hot topic for me and the work that I do, is this triad between the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim.
Yes. Say more about this. This is really relevant to everything right now.
It is. So in the postmodern value system that really focuses exclusively on care, the moral value of care, which is the opposite of violence. It's the opposite of aggression. It's the opposite of hierarchical domination of a dictator. All the things that Trump, our precious leader, seems to embody.
Yes, I money, sex, and power. Me and Trump, we share this as an embodiment. So we get all the projection.
I don't know about you, but I get a lot of those too. I think
you're an authority figure. You're the head of the
This is why you and I liked each other and didn't mind sparring with each other.
In this liberal worldview, there's this victim triangle is played out in they need victims to define their own virtue. So by defining other people as victims, they can be saviors, like the poor brown people of wherever. We had some accusations of racism about our conference once because we didn't have enough brown speakers. Actually, what it was is the photographs of the brown speakers were black and white and people couldn't see that they were African-American. Hilarious. But the vast majority of the people attacking us were white. And it was a sort of savior thing going on. And then their own virtue is defined by their own victimhood. So rather than their virtue being defined by I've achieved this, I've done this, I'm a good person, I tell the truth, whatever, it's defined by how much of a victim am I in the categories that are allowed by North American politics, which are very limited categories. It's race, gender, sexuality, blah, blah, blah. There's like 5 or 6 really. And if you're a victim by those categories, you're morally right. And if you're saving people from those categories, you're morally right. And that creates anyone who's not doing one of those two positions, so not claiming to be a victim or a savior, is therefore must be a persecutor, because that's the only free spot left, right?
Exactly. Isn't that perfect?
So what do we do to get out of this? Because it feels like There's a question about personal responsibility, which can look like victim blaming. And that's the moral, that's like the biggest sin in this postmodern world, is to attack a victim or a perceived victim. Also, who defines the victims, right? Like I spoke to someone who was extremely wealthy, grew up in a meditation center, had every conceivable privilege as a child that I didn't have, but she was a woman and black. So therefore I was an aggressor and a victim and dominated her whole life, even though she grew up in a fucking chateau, literally a castle. But that's not one of the categories. Did you grow up in a castle or not?
Yes.
So like, what the hell do we do in that situation?
Well, I have a rule. If I'm working with people, I notice, are they closed? Are they open? Or are they in between? If they're closed, I don't even bother to have the conversation.
Great. Yeah, this is
not useful.
Yeah.
And that's the case with people that are fundamentally, they're fundamentalists believing something that they have no proof.
Ideology there that's infected them. It's a worldview. It's completely, all the barriers are blocked. The fire exits are chained shut.
Exactly.
And my experience said there was only 10% of people attacking us were in that category. 90% were good people with values that I shared, who we could actually communicate with.
So what is this mystery of how this emotion, let's call it a mob mentality, a lynch mob mentality. What is the mechanism by which that 10% can infect, like a virus, a whole bunch of good people in a group that shares a common morality, which has no reason?
Yes. I mean, in a way, it's like the most vicious people win, right? Or what I see them basically doing is saying, listen, if you're a good person, you have to agree. And if you in any way disagree, you support the bad people. And while I'd say 90% were basically had this value of care, which I really agree with, I also saw they didn't necessarily have the courage to stand up to the people that were saying either with us or against us. And it becomes a kind of competitive thing. The other thing I saw is just online, that embodied empathy goes out the window. And Daniela and I really found what helped was picking up the phone, leaving people voice messages. We made a video so people could see that, my bisexual German partner and I were not, Nazis. And it was that I think engaging that embodied empathy was a key piece, actually. And then everyone else went, oh, you kind of seem reasonable. You kind of seem okay. And it was only that 10% that were then left.
Yeah. So one of the things that you did there, to me, this is the beauty of this technology of nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg. When you run into a situation where people are just screaming at each other, there is no communication, there's no openness, there's no possibility of communication. What I do is I follow this template of nonviolent communication. The first thing that I do, which is not in the template, is I drop into Zen mind. What is Zen? What is nothingness? So dropping into this place, this placeless place where there's no right or wrong, no opinions, no feelings. There's nothing. There's just absolute clarity. Dropping into this view, I then look at the insanity of two people screaming at each other. And I drop the conversation to the level of emotions. And we talk about, what are you really feeling? What emotion are you feeling right now? And this is the emotion that I'm feeling. Or if I don't know what emotion I'm feeling, then we begin to explore it. And when we both agree that we're feeling this emotion, then we drop down a deeper level to what need do you have that is not being met? That's causing you to feel that emotion. And what need do I have that's not being met that's causing me to feel that emotion? What we've done is we've dropped down in our level of development, really.
And the fourth piece, I think, is also vital as well, which is, Daniela and I were asking people
like the fourth P of NVC, what would you like? So people would say, you're racist. And we'd say, okay, so what would you like? And they'd say, we want more black speakers. And say, okay, should we talk about that? And, you know, can you introduce us to people? And actually someone introduced us to a really good speaker who I'm now friends with. So I was like, great, like make the request from us. And then there was, you know, from the listening of, okay, you want fairness. That's a value for you. That's a value for us. And here's our values. We also want to have people on who are competent and who aren't, you know, being just, we don't want to be racist and put people on as speakers because of the color of their skin. Like that's racism. So it's, you know, so trying to communicate the needs, the values, and then actually get to this thing of like, what would you like? You know, how can we actually make your life better? Because if, you know, we're here to serve, if we can serve, we will.
Yes. Yes. So that's actually an innovation to what I was saying. I'm gonna add that to my template. That's very good.
Because if someone just wants to scream at you, you go, okay, that's not really cool, and I'm not really up for that. But if you've got a constructive thing you want to add to what we're doing, right?
But by stopping and ask them, what would you like? What do you want? You're just totally listening to them, and you're giving them the opportunity to speak in a way that they, of course, they really care deeply about what they want. That's very, very, that's brilliant. That's a nice innovation.
The only slight problem we had with that tactic is we found that then in the extremists' case, the demands didn't end.
Well, I think that's true of any zealot or any fundamentalist.
Like, how morally contrite do I have to be as a straight white man to be good in your eyes? And I don't think there is a line. Yeah. I don't think there is, like, I could whip myself naked through the streets and it still wouldn't be enough.
So this is where a practice comes in that we use in Integral Zen called skillful inflexibility.
Which is?
It's not yielding your integrity or the ground that you're standing on, not position, but ground. You yield the position.
Yes.
Don't yield the ground.
Yes. And
doing it skillfully, which is doing it from, again, this position of clarity that's beyond opinions and likes and dislikes, and really beginning a process of communication from here. So if you give up your stand, the ground you're standing on, they will not rest until you espouse the same values that they have, which are based on caring for victims.
You know, I quoted Margaret Thatcher at one point. I said, I don't negotiate with terrorists. If you threaten me, there's no conversation. If you want to have a conversation, there's a conversation. And Danielle and I also got very clear about what our bottom lines were. So we said, we're not going to make someone a speaker who isn't good enough, who isn't up to the standard we have, irrespective of what, you know, they're a transsexual Muslim poodle or whatever. We just weren't willing to do that because we said that we want to have equality, because that's actually degrading to them, to the conference, to everyone. We went, this was our line, you know?
Yes.
And we said, we're absolutely happy to be introduced to people who are qualified. Please extend our network. That's a bonus for everyone. So the inflexibility with our sort of hard line, we said, this is what we won't go past.
So this is a really good time to bring in what I couldn't find before, and that's Haidt's the moral matrix that he's referring to, that he's created, which is quite useful tool. So these moral values based on care versus harm, liberty versus oppression is another polarity, fairness versus cheating is another one, loyalty versus betrayal is another one, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation. Now, I don't really like the words that he's chosen, but I guess they're as good as any. You got to choose words, so it's gonna tilt the conversation. But the care versus harm, particularly the caring for people that are victims, which assumes the identity of a rescuer.
Yes.
So if I take the identity that I'm a rescuer and I constantly have to rescue victims, that's actually the worst possible thing I could do, because I'm condemning them to remain a victim.
It's a disempowering position.
And I'm actually becoming a perpetrator, perpetrating the disempowerment and keeping people in the prison of being victims.
Mm-hmm. And by not owning one's inner persecutor, one becomes one, right? Like during the conference, someone said to me, "Oh, you seem to be really thriving under all this pressure." And I was like, "Yeah, I like money and power." And I laughed, and like half the audience that were watching just looked shocked. And I was like, you gotta own that, because otherwise it's going to come out as greed and totalitarianism. If you don't own that you have that desire, at least on some level, if you don't own the fact that you want to get what you want and persecute people who don't want to give you it, like, come on, own that, or it's going to come out in all sorts of weird ways. This is the shadow idea, right?
It is the shadow. It's if you disown, if I ignore the fact that I really am concerned with power, this is not an ugly thing. It's only ugly if you do evil things with it. The fact that you have an ability to choose and volitionally choose is what makes us human. This really differentiates us. So to ignore that and just go along with this victim mentality of helping all the victims and not choosing to help them become responsible human beings, not empowering them to take responsibility for what's making them a victim and changing their lives.
Mm-hmm.
It's
you've got Zen privilege. Clearly, you've got Zen privilege. Zen is not a safe space, is it? I think that's you can put that.
Zen is not a safe space.
Mm.
It is, especially Renzai Zen, which is a samurai tradition.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Safe spaciousness. Unsafe spaciousness. Put there. There's the name of your book right there. Yeah. Unsafe spaciousness, a postmodern approach to Zen. So
that's actually quite good.
It's quite good, isn't it? I was quite pleased with that. That's a gift. That's yours. Pleasure.
See what happens when you accept your wanting power and fame,
and when you keep a sense of humor. Like I feel like in some ways Zen is the only religion with a sense of humor. I'm going to upset all the other religions now. I mean, I know there are funny stupid guys and blah blah blah, but as a core part of it, humor seems right at the core of Zen. Well,
it certainly is in our Zen. I don't know that that's universal, but it's certainly true in Integral Zen and in Hollow Bones Zen, my teachers.
That's the lineage: Hollow Bones, Integral Zen, Mundo Zen. And okay, let's go back to the where's the flow here? Postmodernism, Zen. How has Western civilization improved Zen?
Religions tend to die. They're like people. They're born, they have a youthful period, they have a maturing period, and they have a period of old age and death. They're cyclic.
Yes.
Renzai Zen had all but died in Japan in the 18th century. And a Zen master by the name of Hakuin, who was a real troublemaker as well, single-handedly revitalized it and breathed new life into it. Now, I've heard many people say that if you go to Japan, the institution of Zen is there, but the spirit of Zen has died.
Yes, it's a stale, hollow form of the religion rather than the actual practice.
Exactly. Nobody's waking up. They're preserving the form, but very few people.
90% of Thai Theravada Buddhists don't meditate. Like that's the case in other Buddhist traditions too. Yeah.
Yes. So I think the value of Western civilization to Zen is providing a fertile context where people are really hungry to touch something bigger than their narcissism, their sense of self.
So the massive narcissism of the West is the greatest gift because it creates a huge hunger for something else.
There's some truth to that.
I was on the phone to an American liberal last night, and I said to her, listen, I'm standing outside the masseuse that I'm waiting to go see to get a massage at the end of a 15-hour workday, and I'm standing in the rain to talk to you. Can we wrap up this call? And, hoping that would make it clear that I wanted to go. And this person said, yeah, but I'm more important than that. And I was like, really? Seriously? And they talked for another 5 minutes before I eventually hung up. And and it was funny. I love this person. I really like this person, but the absolute narcissism. Like, I'm exhausted. I'm just trying to get to my master's. I'm waiting. I'm late. The narcissism showing up in different ways, right? And in postmodernism, when meaning is taken away, when boundaries and structures taken away, what's left is nihilism and narcissism, right?
Oh, a perspectival madness and a lot of shadows.
And this is the other piece the West has added, right? Shadow work. That's not a Zen thing.
Oh, yes. This is, my students are starting to call me the shadow Roshi.
So just for those that don't know, shadow is that which we repress and deny. It's a Western therapeutic idea, not a Zen idea, yes, or a Buddhist idea of any kind.
I was explaining what shadows are during one of the sessions, one of the retreats. And I went into this lengthy, way too intellectual discussion of what shadow is, because it's an area that I've spent my life working on. And it's because I have so many shadows. So all of a sudden, this one young lad, very bright, his eyes lit up. And he says, "Oh, shadows, that's just the me that I can't see." And I said, "Yes, that's what a shadow is."
Yes, the me you can't see. And as a result of not seeing it, we overreact to things. So, if I have a vulnerability shadow, for example, I might want to protect all the poor refugees, or I might get hateful towards them, and I might overreact in the other direction and go, I can't stand these vulnerable refugees, might be the other. Or I might fall in love with kittens, and many ways that can go, but it's some sort of overreaction that isn't really in contact with the reality of the situation.
It's an emotional reaction that you're having that is, you could say it's unreasonable. There's nothing causing it that's visible.
Yes. And when your friend has
causing it is in shadow, it's invisible. It's part of the me that you can't see. And the problem with shadows is we dissociate whole parts of our subpersonalities. Whole subpersonalities are repressed and denied, but they're still active.
Yes.
This is what causes war. This is what causes a genocide.
Yes. Okay. So it's a concrete example of it causing war, maybe something like Germans pretending to be lovely and nice and cooperative and everything's all good. And there's a sort of repressed anger there.
There's a repressed arrogance there.
Okay.
This is if we go deeper to the archetypal level, the problem that became so horrific in World War II with Hitler was this underlying belief and resonance that we are the master race. And that corresponded to an equal problem in the Jewish, we are the chosen people.
Yes.
So the master race and the chosen people, this is just a recipe for disaster.
Got it. So we're the master. Well, it's really we're the master race. No, we are. I mean, Judaism is the most racist religion, but it's the Japanese also have the idea of being the master race. That's still
every ethnocentric traditional religion is racist.
I think some more than others, though. So,
absolutely.
Islam, for its many crimes, certainly doesn't claim an ethnic superiority. So there is a difference between Islam and Judaism, and there's other differences I could put the other way that would, not be so good on Islam. But like Islam says is actually more about the creed, whereas Judaism is more about the ethnicity.
Yeah.
So our differences.
Islam came about in 700 AD. This is a time when we're moving from religious dogma to ideologies. So Islam is really a movement into ideologies.
Yes.
So it's divorced itself from the ethnic roots.
And these things
I look at developmentally as well.
Yes. Well, I wouldn't say it's more developmental. Okay. I'll argue that one another time. But it is certainly a way which we can embody these things even if we don't believe in them, right? Like I have very Jewish friends in Israel I've been many, many times who are in no way religious. They would no way cognitively believe that they were the master race or they're the special chosen people of God. They would no way believe that, but that is still embodied on some level in their being.
It's embodied at an archetypal level.
Mm-hmm.
This is the power of the archetypes. this is one of the things that Jordan Peterson has really activated. There's an understanding of Jung and the archetypal interaction of things that he brings to the table that is very interesting. He's become such a lightning rod for a whole group of people who didn't have a voice. He's their voice.
Yes, I think there was a group of people who were tired of being made wrong and who were looking for structures and boundaries in the same way as I found in the martial arts, particularly young men, but other people too. And he spoke to these archetypes like, hey, there is such a thing as the good king. All kings aren't tyrannical, the patriarchy. There's another archetype there, the noble king, the good king, the servant leader. Or there is such a thing as the devouring feminine, not just the feminine mother. Feminine violence is essentially what he's talking about. A lot. That's the postmodern violence, right? The group shaming and the private undermining. I really have learned this the hard way. There's another, I learned martial arts for years to defend against violence. And you know what I feel like I have now? Totally the wrong set of tools for postmodern age. If people want to fight me, that's quite easy, but that doesn't happen. That's linear masculine violence. That happens very rarely to me. Much more common is this devouring mother archetype, or the what would be the archetype of the sort of underhanded, round the back, sideways, dagger in the back violence.
Passive aggressive violence, you mean?
Yes, that's the postmodern violence, right? Or group shaming, as we talked about.
Well, it's being totally ignorant, being overly conscious of the care harm moral value, and totally ignorant of the loyalty betrayal value, and being also ignorant of the authority subversion and the sanctity and degradation value.
And the archetype of the authority figure being certainly in the shadow, hence the reaction to it.
A wonderful example of that, George Bush I just passed away.
Yeah, okay.
So this is all over the news in America. And he's really portrayed as a servant leader. He and Trump are both Republicans.
Yes.
But he's being portrayed as that noble king that brought kindness. Now, of course, kindness is a postmodern, you get many points for being kind. You get no points for being strong.
Yes.
In the sense that you were talking about.
Sure. The yin, not the yang. The yin is what's portrayed, not the yang, and the yang is in shadow. Yes, very interesting.
It's an interesting balance. So it's just a juxtaposition of the tyrannical king in Trump versus George Bush and the funeral and all the respect that he's just.
I was surprised by how positively he's been talked about, because I remember it too. But I feel like if you juxtapose him with Trump, this is sort of, it's like having a really fat friend to look skinny. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
There's a moral relativism there. And
exactly.
Okay, so let me come back to this idea of authority and the troublemaker then. So sometimes you describe yourself as a troublemaker. I think we're both kind of rebels. Junpo is definitely in that kind of line. We talked about Jordan Peterson, who's a bit of a, kind of a troublemaker in this postmodern world, though I actually don't think he tries to be. I really just feel like that's just how he's positioned. This is what the archetype of the trickster, the troublemaker, the rebel. I know they're not the same. These seem to be really at the surface right now, because there's something in this postmodern trend which is deeply conformist, is deeply about you have to toe a line, you have to say a certain viewpoint. You're not allowed to say certain things about gender, for example. And Peterson will say, well, there's some facts here from Sweden you might not be aware of, and people freak out. And it's there's something deeply conformist about this postmodern trend, and the place of the rebel. And also, there's also something shadowy about the rebel. There's something very teenage about this trend, which is no one tells me what to do. And, Zen is boundaries and sit down, and, it's discipline, it's austere. And it's like it's being a Zen rebel is itself a koan, it's itself a paradox, right? Speak a little bit, as we wrap up here, speak a little bit more to this idea of a rebel archetype or the Zen troublemaker.
Yeah. Well, if we look at the continuum between the court jester, who's the only one that can poke fun at the king and get away with it and live.
Yes.
And the continuum between that and the revolutionary with flags waving in his brain. Again, we're looking at, I look at this developmentally, we look at it from the Middle Ages to modernity, where we've moved from a feudal system of loyalty to the king to a postmodern system of an ideology that has bound people together in a way that makes them blind.
Yes.
So the rebel is the hero. The rebel is the hero that sees that the current society, the current rules of the current socio-cultural system, the system has died. The rules are no longer forming. The center is falling apart. And the rebel is the hero that goes outside of the system, goes down, it's.
But that's exactly how postmodernist protesters think they are. They think they're the rebels against the system. They haven't realized they are the fucking system now.
Well, you see, they don't see the change that's happened. This is the amphibian problem. Put a frog in a pot of water and turn on the heat, and it won't realize the temperature's changing until it's dead. This I saw this at Findhorn. I've done 2 retreats at Findhorn.
Yes, I wanted to ask you how you went down there. I got invited there yesterday. I'm not sure if I want to go.
Actually, I love Findhorn.
Nice.
The first time I was there, what I felt was the spirit of Findhorn the spirit has gone underground.
Okay.
Because what made it alive in the 60s, it's a really good example of a spiritual center that the spirituality has seeped into the sand and become a meaningless ideology. But it's still there, and it's in the land. And when I was sitting there in the Great Hall, I felt the spirit that was there calling to me to give it a voice. The voice has died. Give me the voice.
Yes, and what was radical in the 60s, this is the developmental conversation. I just point listeners to the episodes with Ben Scanty and Keith Martin Smith, where we talk more about this developmental conversation coming from Ken Wilber. And Ken Wilber's episode will be out in a while, actually. The developmental conversation here is like, what was the lead edge in the 60s that led to Esalen, that led to Findhorn, beautiful places, noble intentions, done some fantastic things. So I want to honor them. And maybe that's not the lead edge anymore. And it feels like there's, we've seen this at Van Welden, is it called, in the Netherlands as well? Like there's this battle for the soul of the lead edge. And some of them are really stagnating and others are moving forward. Like people from Finland have been contacting me and saying, hey, I hear you're doing these cool online things. We want to get in on that. And I'm like, great, let's talk. I'll help you out. Because there's a technology that comes with the lead edge. And it's not the same as the sort of back to nature hippie technology.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it?
Okay, well, unfortunately, we do need to wrap up. This is juicy as ever. So a couple of things to finish. Where can people find out more about Mundo Zen?
Integralzen.org.
Integralzen.org. Okay, great. Doshin, thank you. Do you have a we always ask people at the end, what's your final parting message about the body?
Trust it. The body never lies.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Nice to talk with you, sir.
Wonderful to see you again.
Subscribe to get more. And you can also leave us a review on iTunes, which helps with our rankings. So really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support the podcast even more, then fund us. Go to Patreon. Give us $1 per episode. Those who don't know, Patreon's a really good way of supporting things you want to see more of in the world. I know so much is available for free now, and what I'd say is a lot of energy and effort goes into this podcast. I put it out there for free so everyone can get it. Maud and I work on this. Everyone that wants it can have it for free. And if you want to support us, it is really appreciated. So it's patreon.com/Mark Walsh. And of course, if you want any in-person training, you can visit embodiedfacilitator.com. There's loads more resources there too.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.